I want to thank everyone for coming today. I'm Megan Morin. I'm the Keen Program Coordinator, and I will allow Rich to introduce himself as well.
Yeah, Richard Goldberg. I'm faculty in Applied Physical Sciences at UNC Chapel Hill, and we're excited to be a part of this effort.
So I shared a little bit in the beginning, but this is something we've been working on for a little bit of time and kind of evolved from different faculty development initiatives we've done here at UNC with the faculty learning community, which we'll share in a bit. But we are actually going to get started with a warm-up activity. So I'm going to put a Google Doc link into the chat. And what we're going to ask you to do is first to make sure that you can access it. But what questions do you have when you hear micro-moment activities? Is there anything you're wondering about? And we want you to list as many questions as possible in 2 minutes. And we are encouraging you to put as many crazy out there questions as you want. And I'm going to start the timer in a moment to take some time to, allow you to reflect on this. Does anyone have any issues with accessing the document? Awesome. So I'm going to start the timer for 2 minutes, and I want you to list as many questions as you have as possible. And that is 2 minutes, and my timer is not going off on your screen, but finish your question, and we are going to take a look at your activity or your questions. So what does it really mean? What are they? We are obviously going to talk about that. What preparation is required? How long do they last? Is there a time limit? How does this work online? How does this work in an asynchronous course? What is your favorite example of this? How do you explain to students? And so I feel like today we will communicate a lot of this to you today and share with you where we are in this process and how you can actually help to contribute to these activities. And so what you actually just did was a micro-moment activity. And so we'll talk to you a little bit about what that actually is defined as. But as you can see, we just did a very quick couple-minute activity to get started with this session. And what we're hoping from you by the end of this live discussion, that you are going to be able to describe strategies that can allow for easy implementation of entrepreneurial-minded learning, that you are going to be able to recommend strategies surrounding the 3 C's and actually evaluate this project and give us feedback. And most of these activities are going to be done through a Mirrorboard. And so if you've never used the Mural tool, we're going to walk you through that as well. And also have some discussion surrounding, what does EML look like in implementation? How, when do we see the most success? And actually share with you where this idea kind of rose from our own experience with our faculty learning community. And so to answer some of the questions that you've already shared or asked, what is a micro-moment activity? So to kind of take a step backwards, how this essentially came about was, as I shared, we have a faculty learning community here at UNC that was to support our faculty in using entrepreneurial minded learning. And so we are starting a new engineering major and minor that is going to have EML integrated throughout the curriculum. And so, with this FLC, we were supporting faculty in our department and in different STEM departments across campus. And so when we're doing this, and, we were going through the different framework, the Keen framework, we were finding a lot of the resources that we were providing faculty were, larger implementations. They were big projects. And we quickly found out that this was becoming difficult for faculty to digest. And so we spoke with a colleague after her first two meetings, and we were, trying to figure out the best way to do this. Our colleague, Kelly Hogan, suggested, do bite-sized implementations, just create micro moments. And this is really where this idea kind of flourished from. And so how we're defining micro moment activities are as implementations of EML or any, really any pedagogy in less than 30 minutes. So we're talking from 2 minutes like we just did to 30 minutes. And so, what we were finding, we, had this idea of micro-moment activities, but we also wanted to support faculty in doing these larger projects. So we started with implementation guides around each of the 3 C's of curiosity, connections, and creating value. And so what we were finding though, with these implementation guides, they had a list of strategies and examples and links to, dive into it further, but it was still taking up too much time. And we wanted to provide a resource to faculty that we could literally hand to them a strategy to quickly implement and leave our, leave our meeting, and they were implementing, they could implement the next day. And so, we really dove into this micromoment activity to create a resource for faculty where they could easily implement EML into their courses. Because as we know, faculty are very busy. We are specifically at UNC, we're at an R1 institution where a lot of our faculty have their own research labs and heavy teaching loads, as many faculty are dealing with all these challenges too. So there's also research to prove this. So, especially at our institution and many institutions with doing these different pedagogical changes, it's very hard. There's lots of barriers, and it comes down to two things typically, is time and effort. And again, this is something that we've had heavily in the back of our minds as we are designing, these micromoment activities. And so how this project, came about was we had this engineering fellowship funding where we could dive into a project a little further of something of interest, and we found it a perfect opportunity to create a set of micromoment activities. And so what we are coming up with are, about 25, at least 25 micromoment activities where faculty could easily pull up the strategy, look at an example, and have other resources associated with this. Another piece to this, though, we didn't want to just do it electronically. We actually wanted to have a physical card deck handy. So if you attended the Key National Conference last year, and let's make sure you can see this okay, you would have gotten a reflection collection card deck. And I said, you can tell it's I've used this a lot because there's coffee stains all over. But what it is an actual physical card. And each of these cards has a strategy for to promote reflection in your classes. And so, faculty could pick this up, implement a reflection strategy, and start implementing. And we both thought, Rich and I were like, well, why don't we do this for EML? And so essentially we came up with creating a micromoment activity card deck. So faculty could pick up a card, find a strategy that works for the class, and start implementing immediately. And so I'm actually also, I will share with you in the chat the Joe's cards as well, if you did want to see that. So to kind of go into this a little bit further, this would be an example of what we're creating. So right now, in the beginning of the session, we did an abbreviated version of question formulation technique. And so what QFT is this like multi-step process for students to learn how to develop questions. And so it's a great technique, but sometimes could be time consuming. But what we did was we just put out one small piece of that, and we created an activity that faculty could easily use to do in 2 minutes. And so what you would see on this card is the outline of the strategy with the example, just like what we did, but also resources to other King cards. And so on each King card is assigned a number in the link. And so we wanted to be able to give faculty an opportunity that if they did want to fully implement, question formulation technique or some of these strategies, they did have a resource that they could easily access to do that. So what we want to do is actually hear from you, how EML is being implemented on your campus. And so what I'm going to do is put a mural link into the chat so we can hear from you. So if you have not used Mural before, so this is a collaborative tool. There's other things out there like Jamboard, Miro, M-I-R-O, that's another tool. But we typically actually use this tool often with our FLC, or faculty learning community, to collaborate. And this can be used in person or virtually. And so we are going to do a couple activities with this in a second. But what I do want to note, if you haven't used this tool before, on the left side, there's a couple icons. And so we will be using a lot the text. So if you click on the text, you'll see a variety of Postit Notes. And all you would do when we go to do these activities is drag a Postit Note over, and you can start typing your response. The other feature that will probably also be helpful to many of you is the zoom feature, to be able to zoom in and out. So if you look in the right corner. I mean, there is a zoom in and out, but you can obviously also use the little like cursor thing on your mouse as well. So did anyone have any questions so far about the mural tool before we start our discussion? Awesome. So the first thing we're going to ask you to do, and you can see if, can everyone see my screen? Or everyone should probably be okay on their Mirrorboard. We're focusing on this first block where it says, what are you doing on campus? So you can see there's multiple blocks on this Mirrorboard. So we're just asking you to zoom in onto your board where you are just looking at that first block. And so the first two questions we're going to ask you to take a couple minutes to participate in is to take a Post-it note and put each idea on each Post-it note. What are some micro-moment activities that you or your colleagues have used before? And how did it go? And I put a note on there, especially the failures, because a lot of the time, that's where we have learned the most, obviously. So we're going to take a couple, like I said, take a couple minutes to add some initial thoughts, and then we're going to start talking about it. So we see some Padlet activities, looks like some engineering challenges with bridge building. Fermi Friday, I want to know what that's about. Okay, does anyone want to come off mute and start sharing a little bit about what they posted or other ideas?
I can tell you what Fermi Friday is.
I would love to hear that because I'm really curious about that.
Just starting classes on Fridays with having the students do Fermi problems. Right, these really kind of crazy lack of information estimation problems.
Okay. I hope that's an engineering term that my engineering education background did not provide me. Okay, thanks, Neil.
Yep.
So how do your students respond to the, Fermi Fridays? Is there like excitement around it, or how does that usually work?
Yeah, it kind of depends a little bit on what the particular problem is, but we'll try to get them to actually. I mean, they're supposed to be kind of fun because they're a little bit outlandish, but they're also a very, very common engineering tool, like right at the beginning when you're trying to get just kind of rough ideas on how things work, is be able to do some estimation when you have very little information to work with. So it's a very useful technique, but I try to introduce it as something that's just kind of fun and sort of off the wall, but we do it regularly and it really helps them develop that kind of thought process.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, we only take like about 10 minutes to do that. So.
Does anyone want, especially if you did the bridge building with straws and tape, that sounds like fun. Did anyone want to share?
Yeah, that was one of mine. That was for an introduction to engineering technology course. And it just took too long. It was meant to fit kind of in that 30-minute time frame.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't work out well in that context, so the students never finished. And so and then we were supposed to have time to finish it in our teams, and then COVID happened and they never met together again. So it was one of those we dropped. We want to kind of re-implement it in some way, but we haven't found a good fit with our students remote yet.
So where did a lot of the time seem to be going towards, like the building part or like the introduction or anything like that? Or everything.
It was spread out. There's students who were coming back to college after being away for many years. So some of them were hesitant to talk to their neighbor, and some of them, so it was a good ice-breaking activity. It did get them talking to each other, mm-hmm. which was good, but they spent a whole lot of time defining what they were supposed to do. Not asking what they were supposed to do, but I don't know. There was a lot of talking and not a lot of doing. I still haven't figured that one out.
No, it seems like especially engineering challenge type activities can take a bit of time.
Yeah. But I do this with sixth graders. I've traveled all over the state and done this with sixth graders and not had an issue.
I'm a former middle school teacher, so that's why I'm saying with my own experience, anytime we did those engineering challenges, 20 minutes turned into longer than that. So no, that's great though. But it is trying to find that happy balance. Did anyone else, a third person, want to share an activity that they do? Try to just quickly implement something to get the class more engaged.
I'll mention that I've done the activity that we just did at the beginning of this session today, the question formulation. I've done that in class before and had it just fail because nobody wanted to contribute. And so this was great. You all had lots of questions, but if people don't feel like thinking about questions, then it can flop.
Yeah, and that's where, so also to make note, like that's with these cards, we're trying to put tips in here that, like, Rich's own experience with this, it's helpful to know this, that the students need more coaching on how to ask questions. And so
Or
some of
incentive also to just.
I was trying to be nice about it, yeah. So some of the time, obviously, you just have to be prepared that, and we'll also know we're piloting these activities. We'll talk about this more. But I guess just to ask everyone overall, how is EML or any type of active learning approach implemented on your campus? Do you find that it is, easier with these large implementations because they do, work best in these over long periods of time, or these short implementations? How does that work for each of you or other colleagues on your campus?
I'll speak for our campus, Megan. The reason that I find the work that you guys are doing so interesting is because most of the implementation that we have taking place, and we have implemented in every program from the first introductory course through our capstone at this point, but it's almost all projects, larger activities. And so I think it's really interesting to think about ways that you can break that down into smaller bite-sized chunks, as your one faculty member put it, because this EML fits very nicely into project-based courses. It's kind of a slam dunk into capstone, but how do you fit it into other courses where maybe you already have other projects that you really like and don't want to change a whole lot? Or how do you fit it into other courses that don't lend themselves as easily to these large sort of projects? So most of ours are project-based, and I'd love to think about more ways to implement these kind of bite-sized pieces.
No, that's great, Lindy. I think a lot with faculty on our campus, we have found that they are doing a lot of EML-esque things, and that some of it's just like fine-tuning and giving them more tools for them to pick from to kind of develop their teaching a little bit further, that they may not necessarily need to do a full project, but small activities to, incorporate this pedagogy. Others, how do things work on your campus with implementation of EML or other, pedagogy techniques? Is this something you all talk about on your campus? Is, your teaching with active learning or strategies or activities, or is it everyone doing their own kind of thing?
Neil, you have pretty small classes, I imagine, there, right? So are there?
Yeah.
But as you think about scaling, have you been having these kinds of conversations like, oh, how am I going to scale some of these things? What do I need to do differently as we scale, because we're going to be growing?
Yeah, we haven't had to worry about that yet. I mean, it's interesting just because we're sort of the only engineering program, and everything else is sort of sciences, that the topic of sort of entrepreneurial mindset doesn't really necessarily come up that much. That being said, I mean, there is a lot sort of across programs that very much engages in what we would typically call entrepreneurial mindset, or at least these sort of active learning engagement types of things, even at the design of an entire course. So there are some integrative laboratories, for example, that rather than doing individual experiments, the entire semester is really one experiment, right? That just is broken down into smaller pieces that get executed. So, so I think there's a lot of activities that are going on, but I don't think we talk about them in sort of a common language, I guess.
And I think that's one thing we're trying to also do in these cards is with EML or Entrepreneurial Minded Learning, or the 3 C's with curiosity, connections, and creating value, is finding common language, specifically towards the Keen framework too. So we understand the trouble with some of the common language, especially with teaching, making sure everyone understands what you're talking about. So did anyone, I want to give one more opportunity, if any failures, or how did it go anytime you have implemented smaller activities? Taking too much time, we've talked about already. Are there other things? Go ahead.
Can I share my failure?
Absolutely.
Okay. So what I did is this year, after 1.5 years of remote teaching and learning activities, starting, we have, by the way, we have term system, 7-week term. So starting August, I went to campus, and I was given an introductory course of physics. I am a physics professor, so introductory course of 144 students. So I requested the department, I want to do active learning in that class. So please give me peer learning assistance. The learning assistant, we call peer learning assistance at WPI. So I got 3 peer learning assistants, so 144 is to 3. So that is the, including me, 144 is to 4. That was the student instructor ratio, let's say. And so I did pretty hard work from my side. I developed worksheets based on virtual activities, simulations. In large class, I cannot take the real physical gadgets in the classroom. In the specific, I had to, we have 50 minutes time for the class. So that student liked it, but the problem was the resources. We had only 3 PLAs, 3 learning assistants, and out of that, sometimes one became sick, sometimes other became sick. So students had a kind of, I inserted one question in my course evaluation at the end of the term. That was related to the activity, these extra activities in classroom, scaled up classroom. In smaller classroom, compared to that, I have active learning classes of about 70 students. So I said that is a smaller class, but this was larger class and in a traditional classroom. So things went well, but students found that they got less help in this class. So that means there was a problem of resources. So I said that with my department, the department head, hopefully, if I do this class of this way next year, to engage more EML ideas, to include more EML ideas. So probably I might get more resources. I don't know. Right? So that depends on money, right? How much money we have.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And that's what it's very
I just wanted to share my with you all my kind of effort to make everyone engaged in learning, but that was partially successful, but not 100%, of course. Thank you.
No, thank you for sharing that. I think a lot of the time it's difficult with those larger classes, how to do active learning or any pedagogy with that caliber of how many students. And that is actually something we often, work with faculty to try to figure out how you can do these things at that level. And so, I think a lot of getting, like you said, talking to students and asking what works, why wasn't it working, really helps you to kind of narrow down some of those problems you're seeing in your courses.
Yeah, one more thing I would like to add is I do multiple types of courses. I also teach a smaller size course, about 40 students, and there I am using very successfully since last 5 years. I'm using very successfully these projects incorporated the projects very successfully. But for these large classes, it is very difficult because particularly because of lack of enough resources.
Mhm. Well, hopefully next year you can do it again with more resources. Yeah. So good luck, but I'm sure it's going to be great. And if you're getting feedback from students, you'll be able to figure that out. And so at this point, we're going to actually go to the core of what we're hoping to do from today is to get your ideas or resources or materials that you think will be helpful to us. So to give you a little background of really where we are at this process. So with this project, we are actually going through King cards or resources to create these micromoment activities. So things or strategies that typically can take a lot of time from class. We are trying to pull out those small activities, those micro moments for faculty to start acclimating to this pedagogy and using these techniques. And so what we're going to ask from you is to go now to the Mirrorboard, to the middle portion where it says brainstorming. And we just want you to reflect for a moment about how you can do like ideas that you have or you have done or resources that you think that is helpful to everyone here and to this project of activities that take less than 5 minutes, 5 to 15 minutes, activities that take 15 to 30 minutes. And obviously it's hard to write some of these out on a little Post-it note, but we're going to take 10 or 15 minutes. We're going to start with 10 minutes and then kind of check in is ideas you have or resources. And that's what we're trying to give you time. If you have to pull any kind of resource, we would appreciate that. And I'm sure that your colleagues in here today will also find that helpful. And so did anyone have questions about that before we give you some time to kind of think about your own ideas and learn from each other? Great. So we'll do, I'm going to put, if you look at the top, if you haven't used Mural before, there's actually a timer at the top. We're going to start with 10 minutes to get started. And feel free if you need to turn your video off or something to kind of think through, you're welcome to do that. Is everyone to a stopping point or does anyone need more time? Because we could just start talking about this.
Well, I'm noticing here that people have an easier time thinking of ideas for that take longer amounts of class time.
I completely agree.
Harder to come up with ideas that you can do in 5 minutes or less.
I think from an education perspective, even putting these activities together, it's hard to not fully implement like a specific strategy or technique. Like we did QFT today. We didn't do the full QFT. We did a small piece. So I think those kind of things are sometimes hard to think about of not doing it like a full strategy. Anyone else on the call, like why do you think this is so hard to find activities less than 5 minutes?
I think it depends a little bit on the size of the class.
Mm-hmm.
I think since generally we have, just trying to herd X number of students into an activity, right? That's 5 minutes just to get everybody focused, not necessarily, being able to do something. So
that's very true.
I think some of the really short activities are pretty well established too, like think, pair, share, that kind of standard active learning things where you just are breaking up the class a little bit. And you probably look at a list of active learning techniques and a lot of them can be applied into that bucket of 5 minutes or less.
That's a great point.
I'm really liking this one comment over it on brainstorming, but applying like how that relates to the topic of sustainability. So I think a lot of the things students might be familiar with that are shorter, if we just focus them a little bit differently, I think it fits in really well. That, that gets me thinking about all sorts of ways I can use things I already do that. And I'll admit this, the EML is really new to me. I heard that for the first time last week. So I'm still figuring out all of the language.
So I'm the one who put that comment in there. And I actually as I first started to write that, I just said I put down brainstorm practical applications, but I thought that's too broad. and students are all interested in sustainability. And so by, trying to focus it, I think that helps get, I was talking before about how do you get students to avoid just being passive, to really participate. And sustainability will, get people going more than just saying practical applications.
I show them things sometimes and I say, okay, I haven't written this one down because I forgot I do this, but I show them a picture of something and I say, okay, tell me all the places you think this might break.
That's great. So identifying the problems. And so how do students typically respond?
They like that one. Students tend to like looking for how things are going to fail.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. That one.
And how do you think you could do that? So, that would be in like a material science class, I assume, or some kind of mechanical engineering class. How can you broaden that to make it more general, that something you could apply to any engineering class?
Oh, things go wrong all over the place. It's not just mechanical failures.
Yeah.
It's also, social failures. Like how is the business or the society or most of my students work. So it's good to apply that back to their day-to-day work lives. What are the 3 top things that bother you about your place of work? What's not working? Why is that not working? How could we fix that? How could you fix that? It gets me off topic in my courses, but a little bit. Well, that's one of the things, right? Sometimes we have some really great discussions, but they take a lot of time.
So I see a lot of good strategies. The high five, I already talked about the body storming. Who wrote the body storming?
That was me.
Neil, can you share just briefly a little bit about that?
Yeah, so actually I had one of our faculty from our School of Design come in and work with our sophomore students right at the start of a design project. And she said, instead of trying to focus on what it is that you're trying to build, they said, try to focus on how the person or users you're designing for actually interact with it.
Okay.
Right. So it's more kind of from their perspective rather than from the technical solution, because the students are kind of good at focusing on coming up with technical ways of doing things and thinking less about how people interact. So instead of brainstorming ideas, it's like body storming, sort of using your, how you might act out things.
We may be talking about that further too. All of you have really great ideas. So before we start, we have one more question because I wish we could talk about all of this. Did anyone else have something else they just wanted to share before we go to the last question? Okay, so if you scroll down, this is the last section just to kind of get some quick ideas and feedback. So assessment, that was actually, I saw one of the questions listed in the beginning is how do you assess this? So this is something we are figuring out how to incorporate into the card still. We know this is obviously something we need to think about. And it's a huge part of any time you design any kind of activity or project. How are we assessing this? How are we going to measure student growth? And so we want to know your ideas, and this could be as specific or as general as you're thinking, but how can we measure this? If we do an activity in a couple minutes, what are ways we can measure students that they're understanding the concept or they're demonstrating the 3 C's? We're going to do this all together. And the last part is feedback on this project. So we gave you a very abbreviated version about this project, of these activities. And so the other 2 questions we are wondering about is, how would this work for you and your campus? How would you convince other colleagues of yours to use this tool? And just any general feedback that you have about this project. So we'll do this only for a couple minutes before we conclude today and take any questions that anyone has.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about this before, but thinking about assessment, there's really two kinds of things you could be assessing. One is the quality of the student's work, and the other is the impact of the activity. You know, whether the activity seemed like a useful thing, that the students get anything out of it.
Rich, I was just thinking about how to word something like they want to keep going. You know, I don't know if that's anything useful, but when I would do brainstorming with my program teams at work, one of the things that I would use to determine whether or not an activity was holding value for the team was whether or not they wanted to keep going after the time was up. And if they really seem to be energized and excited about it, because that leads to more input, more involvement, you know, and more innovation.
That's a great point. And I just added something in there. How loud and active were the students?
Yeah.
And I've had some class periods, as rough as this semester was, I had some class periods where the students didn't even realize that class was over. Like I had to cut them off so that they could stop and get to their next class. And that's always a good sign when something like that happens.
Yeah, but I think just assessment with email overall, it's just always the challenge of balancing content, EML, and like you said, if it's worth the time, and how effective the activity is. So these are all great points. We're gonna take about another minute just because we're in the last couple minutes, about 8 minutes left, and we do have one more thing to share with you, and we wanted to take any questions that anyone had. But I think assessment really just to bring to the forefront, like we've talked about, the number of ideas. So quantity, I feel like comes up a lot when you're asking, obviously, students, how many questions did you create? Things like that. And I think a lot of that fosters about the idea of a bad question. I'll say especially with what we did in the beginning today, is getting over that hurdle of not overthinking about what they're putting down or participating in the activity. So like I shared already, I really, first of all, we really appreciate everyone's participation today. Hearing your experiences, your ideas and insight are very valuable to what we're doing, because we want it to not only be used on our campus, but other faculty to use this tool. And so your feedback and ideas are really very helpful. And so where to go from here. So like I shared, we're in the process of putting these activities together. We'll be reviewing them in January, and then around mid-February, we are going to have essentially a list and are looking for faculty to pilot these activities. And so what's really entailed with that is we will share with you this list of activities and have you pick one you want to implement. And then we're asking by May 1st to implement it and do a brief survey. I put down that it's 10 minutes, but I don't even think it will take that long. Just to see how it went. Was this something valuable? How could this activity be better, either better written or better communicated, anything like that? We just really appreciate any kind of feedback. So I am going to put in the chat. It's a brief, a survey to share if you're interested. It doesn't mean that you have to do this, but just letting us know that you're interested in participating in this pilot. And we will, share with you more information in the new year or around February to see if you're still interested in participating. And so at this point, we wanted to open up to any questions that anyone had about the project or other feedback that you wanted to share aloud, or we want to hear it all.
Well, we'd just be really interested in as we start to put this list together of, having you try stuff out and giving us feedback on how it's going. The nice thing about these, unlike a 3-week project, this is something that you get an idea like, oh, I'd like to try that one. I'll try it tomorrow. Like there's no, as someone mentioned, these are really low stakes to get involved and to see how things go. Neil, you were going to say something?
Yeah, it's the I was just thinking, because we've had a lot of diversity and inclusion discussions lately, and I think a lot of faculty have been sort of struggling with how to think about their courses kind of in that context. And I'm just thinking that this sort of card kind of idea right? Is steal that and use that kind of, as a DEI kind of resource as well, just because, it's sort of, you think about EML and, oh, I have to like completely redesign my entire curriculum, and right, that's not the case. You can do it in 5 minutes at the beginning of your class. So I think, it just kind of struck me that this whole format and approach might be really useful in a number of contexts. So.
Yeah, and I think some of the ideas, so I was sitting in on someone else's class and I sat, and there were like 150 people in this course. And I sat in the middle of the room because I kind of wanted to see what was going on in the room, like as though I were a student. And they were being asked to do things like think, pair, share. And I noticed that the students of color were not participating in the think, pair, share like everybody else was. And they might have felt a little out of place, being a minority. And so some of these that I think are a little bit easier, some of the activities that I've seen people throw out here today are a little bit easier for students of color to feel more comfortable getting involved in, rather than, to be a little bit more active, for example, and a little bit, I don't know, a little bit less intimidating for them. So that's a great point, Neil. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, and to address another question that came up, I was thinking this is that, what about if it is virtual or on Zoom? And so the examples that we're putting in there, we will communicate, like if it could be done via Zoom or virtually or things like that. So that definitely in this new world is something worth thinking about as we're putting this together.
Yeah, as we've seen this week, you never know when a school is going to have to switch to remote again, as it's starting to happen for schools that haven't finished their semesters yet.
Did anyone else have any other thoughts or questions before we wrap this up for today? Well, again, I can't say thank you enough to Keen and everyone for hosting us, and this has just been really valuable.
Yeah, thank you all for participating. I hope if your semester is not over, that it finishes smoothly. And if it is over, I hope that you're going to get a little bit of well-deserved rest and relaxation.